We made this video as a part of an introductory videography course at Morgan Community College with the help of an education grant from the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media.
For many of us, this experience introduced us to the practice of videography as well as the practice of land acknowledgement. Whether we were doing research, filming an interview, or editing footage, we completed these tasks on land that is part of the traditional territories of the Arapaho and the Cheyenne.
We acknowledge numerous tribal nations have lived on the land known as Colorado. It is important to emphasize how the lands we occupy continue to be held in stewardship by these indigenous communities.
As you watch this video, we humbly ask that you reflect on this opening statement. We hope this video and any ensuing discussion, learning, or collaboration will honor the sacrifices of the aforementioned indigenous descendants.
Land acknowledgement, a growing practice at Colorado's colleges and universities. This video was made possible by Morgan Community College and the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media. Before we learned about land acknowledgement, we first needed to learn more about the history of Colorado. We met with Morgan Community College social science faculty, Daniel Grafton. He told us about how the conclusion of the Mexican-American War preceded an influx of American settlers.
So that land got absorbed, and then almost immediately gold was discovered in California. And that California gold rush triggered a huge movement of people from the eastern part of the young United States out west to California to try to take advantage of that recently discovered gold. On their way, there were kind of two routes you could take. You could either cross the Great Plains, or you could travel all the way down to Panama and cross there and then back up by sea. Obviously, the easier, more direct route would seem to be directly across the plains, but if you're taking that route, you're going to get challenged by the native peoples who are living out there, right? And in this time period, we're specifically looking at the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Utes, and some of those groups. So that gold rush really triggers the need for some sort of agreement with the native peoples. And that's where we get the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851. That treaty was designed to allow safe passage of these white people who are wanting to cross over, either to take advantage of the gold rush or to settle these new areas that have been added to the United States. And the treaty was designed to provide that safe passage along the Oregon Trail, while also promising the native peoples that they would have full control and uncontested control over the territory of the Great Plains, including large sections of Colorado. That treaty was interesting in that it was also promising the natives $50,000 for the next 50 years, and promised that the United States would make no claims to those lands over that time period. So seemingly the native peoples had a pretty secure position there with the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851.
But the Treaty of Fort Laramie would eventually be replaced by the Treaty of Fort Wise.
After the Treaty of Fort Laramie, what we find is that there is really no pressing need in the first couple of years after that for any shift in U.S. policy. But by 1858, what we're seeing is that there is the inkling that there could be a gold rush in Colorado itself. That gold rush in Colorado is going to shift the tide and suddenly make it a priority for the U.S. government to want to change and do away with the Treaty of Fort Laramie and replace it with something that's going to allow whites to go in and take advantage of that gold rush in Colorado and the Rocky Mountain region in general. So the Treaty of Fort Laramie is going to get scrapped, and they're going to initiate a new treaty, the Treaty of Fort Wise. This treaty is really messy because it was really only completed with a handful of tribal chiefs who were known predominantly as peace chiefs. That includes some famous chiefs like Black Kettle and White Antelope, who would later be present at Sand Creek in the Sand Creek Massacre. And this treaty was signed by them. Their argument was that we are trying to achieve peace for our people, right? We are trying to we recognize the United States is too great of a power, and we are not going to be able to compete with them militarily. So we are going to sign a treaty and believe that this time it's a legitimate treaty. The people on the other side, in particular a group called the Dog Soldiers of the Cheyenne, who were adamantly opposed to this treaty and said that it had been signed without a proper majority of the people accepting it, they argued that this is a sellout, right? And that these peace chiefs were essentially taking bribes and taking gifts that they shouldn't have, and they signed this away to get those gifts and to get the monetary advantages that would come with the treaty. The treaty greatly lessened the amount of land under Cheyenne and Arapaho control. It made about 1/10 of the land that was going to be in Native control under Treaty of Fort Laramie. This is just 10 years later, right? It also took the amount of 50,000 for the next 50 years and reduced that to 15,000 per year. So a radical shift that is very much so not in the favor of Native peoples. And there's kind of a debate about who's right or who's wrong there, but it definitely doesn't come out in Natives' favor there.
3 years and several months after the signing of the Treaty of Fort Wise, the horrific Sand Creek Massacre took place on land established for the Cheyenne and Arapaho people through the treaty.
Sand Creek Massacre is a situation really orchestrated by the governor of Colorado at that time and his kind of favored lieutenant, a Colonel John M. Chivington. And Chivington had won renown at the Battle for Glorieta Pass in the Civil War, but he was maybe questionable as far as his military background and experience went outside of that kind of brief interlude. They established a 3rd Regiment of Infantry in Colorado and put that together as a kind of mobile fighting force that would increase their military resources, but they did this in reaction to kind of the aftermath of some of these decisions where Natives started to realize that these were untenable living circumstances, right? And that they had been pushed into such a marginalized, small amount of land that they could no longer practice their traditional ways of life and could no longer practice their traditional economic system. So what happens is Chivington had these guys, and they were called the 100-dayers, because that was the length of their term, essentially. Well, they're starting to run out of time to do anything. And most of these guys were untrained miners. They were not, trained professionals or military men or veterans. And he takes them down to southeastern Colorado looking for the Cheyenne and Arapaho. And Black Kettle had taken them to a place called Sand Creek, which is a bend in that river. And what he did is he basically snuck up on them and kind of came at them. And this was a kind of peaceful tribe setting that had, very few military members. Most of the military members were off hunting at the day that Chivington arrived. And what we see is that they just attacked indiscriminately, killing men, women, children. They abused the bodies of the dead in pretty horrific fashion. They would take artifacts, I guess you might say, from the bodies. Many people were scalped. Many were scalped multiple times. Children were used for target practice, the dead bodies of children. Many people who tried to hide were found and then massacred. White Antelope, one of the chiefs we mentioned earlier, White Antelope was shot down even as he was waving the flag of peace. So it was a brutal massacre, several hundred people executed essentially, and really revealed the worst excesses of Americans in this process of relieving Native Americans of their land, essentially stealing the land from Native Americans. I should add that the after effects were pretty horrible as well. Thankfully, one of the lead men at Sand Creek, Captain Silas Sewell, refused to lead his men in the massacre and pulled them back. And had he not, the death toll might have been significantly higher. However, he held them back and then later testified before Congress that Chivington was responsible for this massacre and had done this thing. Unbelievably, for the rest of their days in Colorado, Chivington remained a hero, right? Because of this massacre to Coloradans. while Silas Sewell was actually assassinated a few years later by a Chivington supporter on the streets of Denver. So I think this is really telling about the way that Native tribes were treated by whites and their views that Natives were really just inconsequential and a barrier to be pushed through in a lot of ways.
The genocide of Native people led to the conditions we see today in Colorado and across the United States.
So what we see today in Colorado is that there's only 2 remaining Native American reservations. Both are a part of the Ute tribe. And around the country, what we've seen is that Native peoples were marginalized. That's the key word. Native peoples were marginalized and pushed onto the worst possible lands available, almost uniformly. And like we talked about with the Treaty of Fort Laramie leading to the Treaty of Fort Wise, what we often see in U.S. history is that Native tribes are not moved just once, but multiple times. And they are forced from one area that was viewed as marginal, but then suddenly became no longer marginal in the eyes of white settlers, to an even more marginal area. So, for instance, the Cheyenne Arapaho kind of in the eastern Great Plains originally, then they get isolated further west, and then they get pushed down south into Indian territory and really rough terrain. And we see this time and time again. Many of these treaties resulted in forced marches or forced relocations that were against these people's wills and often done at very, very poor timing in the year. So, for instance, the Cherokee Trail of Tears is the most famous one, and these people were relocated from Tennessee, North Carolina area out to Oklahoma, and they did this late in the year, harsh conditions, poor food quality, food supply, and thousands died en route. And that's far from the only instance where people were forcibly relocated as part of this process.
After learning about the stealing of land from Native people and understanding some of the motivation of practicing land acknowledgement, we met with Ernest House Jr. and Dr. Chris Nelson to learn more about how land acknowledgement is being practiced at colleges and universities in Colorado.
Well, my name is Ernest House Jr. I'm a senior policy director here at the Keystone Policy Center. I'm a member of the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe from southwestern Colorado. I'm a former executive director for the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs. And really I work with a lot of different organizations and agencies around American Indian issues here, particularly in Colorado and throughout the United States.
So thank you for offering the opportunity to share my insight on land acknowledgement. So my name is Dr. Chris Nelson. I am Laguna, Pueblo, and Navajo from Farmington, New Mexico. I've been here in the Denver area now going on 4 years as a professor with the University of Denver. I am in the Mortgage Higher Education under the Higher Education Department, and a lot of the work that I have engaged in focuses on Indigenous perspectives in higher education. And so in terms of land acknowledgement, this is something definitely that I've been working a lot on in many different ways, not just from a systemic level, but also from a personal level, because I think we often mistaken a land acknowledgement as a statement that an institution makes or a department makes, but in the way I conceptualize land acknowledgement is really about who I am in entering the space. So I am Indigenous, but yet I also realize that the work that I am engaging in is on Cheyenne and Arapaho land, and along with the Ute, the Apache, other northern tribes as well. So we just have to, for me, look at it from a standpoint that I have been impacted by colonialism and genocide through my own lineage, but I am also still benefiting from the displacement of other Indigenous people by being able to be here at the University of Denver working, and my family being able to have their jobs and attend schools and so forth. So for me, what land acknowledgement has really meant is disentangling the notions of colonialism and as it interacts with who I am as a person, with my family, with the community that I want to work with, and also the colleagues that I work with, so helping them along in that practice as well too.
Ernest and Dr. Nelson told us about how land acknowledgement at Fort Lewis College and the University of Denver is just one component of many broader efforts.
There's been policies that I think the institution has looked at that really has educated the non-American Indian community, the non-Native members, as much of how we should be thinking about a different way to approach this. And so another example a couple years ago was the university system talking about, at Fort Lewis College, the need to really express the importance to the American Indian population, the student population, that during graduation, they can wear their traditional regalia in place of their cap and gown. Like, yes, there's a collegiate process and of wearing it, and there's, you know, the symbols of removing your tassel, moving to the left, to the right, and all that, this whole process, and this format and procedural thing that you go through on that day, you know, and these students are having their families there. They're so excited. They may be the first in their family to graduate. And why are we not making our process more supportive of what they just accomplished? And I think by doing those type of steps, we start breaking down the systematic relationship of around higher ed that we need to be talking about, and that I don't think a lot of people do. The land acknowledgements was just another example of, as board chair, I wanted to read some type of statement. I wanted to bring awareness to our own board of trustee members, really, to be honest with you, and said, you know, if I was ever board chair, I'd like to work with the Native Americans, the Native American student groups and organizations, to have them come up with what that language means. I don't want them to ask me, or for it to be like, oh, this is what I think it should be. I think that turns it into a more tokenized approach, and I don't think that's really supportive of all the different cultures and tribal cultures that are there. So gave the question back to them. They came up, they did the research. Of course, we had this additional research that I did at the state around these 48 different tribal nations that call Colorado home. You know, you can identify it down to specifically southwestern Colorado. And they made this amazing statement, and I read it before every Board of Trustee meetings, which we have, you know, several throughout the year. They've also now read it we'll read it before every graduation ceremony, because we have 2 and 3 every, you know, at the end of every semester. Ceremonies were at the beginning of the graduation ceremony. And then we also now have some of the teachers, and looks like that'll be getting into more classrooms and having that statement on every class syllabi. So, you know, it's in every syllabus, and I think that also is just another expression of the support to such an important relationship in history that I don't think, you know, that we missed, I think, previously. And it's really cool to be part of that.
So for me, we started, I'm part of a working group. It's called the Land Acknowledgement Working Group from the Morgridge College of Education. And we're not specifically looking to just develop a land acknowledgement, but more so look at other initiatives that are happening across the college that are focused on inclusive excellence, and understand how land acknowledgement can be interwoven throughout all of their practices to help everyone critically think a little bit more deeply on how we have individually and collectively benefited from genocide and land displacement, and also then how does it actually play out in the work that we're doing, how we're teaching, how we're interacting with our communities, with our students, and so forth. We're in the very early infancy of the stage of this working group, but what we've been able to do is identify these different layers of what land acknowledgement actually entails. And so we often think of land acknowledgement as a statement that gets read at the beginning of certain events. That's definitely one step in that process, but also asking ourselves, how do we actually turn this land acknowledgement into the underpinnings of a whole event versus it being a box that needs to be checked at the beginning, and how can we think about it before that land acknowledgement is actually read. And what I mean by that is that if we do ask a committee or an event to do a land acknowledgement, that we encourage them to go through their own personal journey of understanding what a land acknowledgement actually means, which then means that they have to interrogate their histories and their personal experiences through colonialism, which is actually a very challenging process because that's not something that we often do or want to do, because it then recognizes violence and loss and that ownership of that and how we have individually benefited from those events that have happened in our history.
Land acknowledgement can help connect the past with the present and lead to important partnerships.
Because land acknowledgements, I think, have been utilized in Canada with First Nations before starts of formal meetings. It's been utilized in Australia and New Zealand as a way to remind people. I mean, they're great reminders and they're great things if they can be utilized the appropriate way. But if there's an opportunity to gain more historic acknowledgement, I feel like that's just another additional step that folks should consider. And what I mean by historical acknowledgement is, instead of getting me or somebody else, an individual up there. I mean, it'd be great if you could hear from that tribal official. It'd be great if you could hear from a tribal elder, or if you could be great from a spiritual advisor, or there could be a song or a blessing, or actually in some instances have reached out and asked if there's any local drum groups, tribal drum groups. And so there might be a statement of a historical context that such and such tribes, we are meeting on their land. We want to give recognition to that history and that culture, and here's we're honored to have a local tribal dance group from the area representing X number of tribes, and a drum group that's gonna sing a couple songs. I mean, that's a way of connecting the past with the present. And so I think that now I'm fearful that people are outside non-native people and organizations would just do land acknowledgements to check a box. And I think that's where we want to make sure and not see people going towards. Or that people are just doing it, and in that process somehow takes away of what the original intent and proposal was, which to give that respect, to bring that acknowledgement, to have people take a moment in time to remember and recognize these indigenous populations that lived here for thousands of years. I mean, the History Colorado and anthropologists there will tell you that Utes have been in what we know as Colorado for the last 10 to 12,000 years. We only lost Colorado within the last 150 years. I mean, really, in 40 years from the 1860s to the 1900s, was really an example just with our tribe, just with one tribe of those 48, the Utes. Those 47 other tribes, those 46 other tribes have their own story that removed them to Oklahoma, to the Dakotas, to Montana, to Utah, to New Mexico. And so it's interesting because there's an important history to be told, and I think an acknowledgement can start placing that seed, but there's much more beyond that.
Through land acknowledgement, we can identify how we have benefited from colonialism and genocide at an individual level, at an institutional level, and within the context of specific topics.
And what that would allow you to do is personally reconcile what colonialism means to you in this contemporary sense. Then in terms of after really diving into that personal level, it's also about looking at the institution itself. Like, what has the institution done? What is the institution doing to recognize Indigenous people, recognize what colonialism means within practices, within norms, within expectations, so all different facets of an organization, not just the individual people, but also practices and norms. Then relating what land acknowledgement actually has to do with a particular topic. So if it's an event, like how does land acknowledgement inform this particular topic? And so whenever someone is delivering a land acknowledgement at the beginning of an event, they're considering all those three areas, right? They're considering their personal experiences, what the institution has represented, what the institution has done, and then linking it into the topic of what actually the event is about. And that in some sense requires a lot of vulnerability, because someone has to openly acknowledge that a lot of times that we have benefited from colonialism and genocide, and understanding what that really means without just saying it to say it, but really to then be intentional how you weave that into the conversation around the organization or the institution, and then again tying it into the actual topic of the event.
And I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of different schools, and I've seen some amazing superintendents. We had some difficult conversations, like through that conversation with Mascots, but then also around like Sand Creek, and working with Governor Hickenlooper about his apology and what does that look like, and him being the first and governor to do an official apology. You know, these are difficult conversations, and I feel like that's why, you know, really a lot of why the general public will be like, oh yeah, you know, like that's tough. American Indians definitely, they got robbed, and it was pretty bad what happened to them, but you know, it's just kind of what happens. And it's like, instead of that approach, it was almost like, look, we're not looking for that apology, we're not looking for the remorse or anything. It's almost like, that's why I think here's the opening, here's this opportunity for land acknowledgements, because it's more appealing, I think, to a broader audience, because it's something they can do. It might be very small and with a short amount of time, but it's something they can do. And I think those are also examples that plant that seed that hopefully somebody in that audience will see. Absolutely. And that's what I told the commission members when that got on the Mascot Commission was, if you're thinking that you're going to come into on this commission and you're going to go to these communities and they're going to change their mind, and the next day they're just going to be like, oh, wow, because you guys showed up from Denver and you've educated me on something I've never heard. Oh, now we're going to change it. If you think it's going to happen, just to get that out of your mind right now. What you're doing is you're planting that seed so that maybe years down the road, that student that heard you talk or give that testimony or provide your perspective from your own tribe or your own culture or wherever it is you're coming from, that when they're principal, like Jeff Rasp, or when they're on the school board, like that person that I talked to in the hallway and got coffee with later, those are the doors that open. And that's where the change comes from.
Land acknowledgement can plant a seed for multi-generational change.
Our hope is that with this land acknowledgement working group, that we'll be able to bring all of our inclusive excellence initiatives together and have a more cohesive understanding of just equity and inclusivity, but more so from a settler colonial lens of what does that mean that we are still living in a settler state where lands have been unceded, where a lot of times indigenous people did maybe give up land based upon certain treaties, but even those treaties were broken. So in a way, we're still living in the in-between of how do we acknowledge the wrongdoings, but yet still benefiting from those wrongdoings, and how do we make them right today? And there's no simple answer to that. I think that's also the really challenging part, is that I don't feel like there's ever going to be a point in time where like our work is done. It's going to be generational. It's going to be many generations to continue this conversation, and I think that as we engage in these conversations, the earlier we can, then we can have impacts on our families, and so then our next generation won't be so resistant to having these conversations, and a different, maybe even more elevated understanding than I have at this moment in time. And so that's really my goal, is to just build upon the knowledge and the frameworks that I have right now, in hopes that future generations will have a different, more complex understanding that can make some significant changes in our institutions.
Thank you for joining us to learn about land acknowledgement at Colorado's colleges and universities. If you are interested in learning more, please visit the resources shared in the YouTube description displayed below this video.